Here, the mere fact that you're here says that the American spirit is alive and well, and they're messing with patriotism now. And as we wake up, it's going to be hell to pay for those who try to prevent us from our constitutional rights here in America. And I personally experienced that as a firefighter when I was going down to the World Trade Center early in the morning. People got out there on cold, windy days and waited just for the fire truck to come in so they could wave us on. You know, and I can't even talk about it without getting misty. But that's the kind of spirit that still exists in America. So anyway, here we are in spite of an effort to pull the carpet out from under us. We had a beautiful venue in Nyack. We had that beautiful theater. The owner was subjected to intimidation, coercion, organized conspiracy. I saw his inbound messages. One from Israel saying smiles from Israel after they promised to boycott him and ruin his business and label him an anti-Semite. So he had no choice but to cancel the event. So, but in spite of that, on the last minute, on short notice, here we are, and that's really wonderful. So without further ado, Christopher St. Lawrence.
What?
Please, strike that. Christopher Bollyn. Christopher Bollyn is an international investigative journalist. He's traveled the world. He has an incredible background. He's lived in Israel. He knows what he's talking about. And he's going to tell you about a fact-checking organization. It wasn't Snopes and it wasn't WikiLeaks, who are not real, okay? It was a real fact-checking organization. They found his facts to be 100% on target.
Correct.
So when you're talking, you know, when you look at this man, we have what I believe a higher power always provides, a champion for the cause, you know. But I don't think we should be looking for heroes and champion, you know, and we should be looking for a hero. But the hero we should be looking for is in the mirror, staring back at us. It's time for us to start waking up. So anyway, without further ado, he is an incredible man. Bollyn.com, if you haven't seen his website and all the stuff he's put together, not to mention his book. All right? So here he is.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at the garden party. There are slides here, so if you want to, you can see the slides. That's good. This tour, the summer tour, is called 9/11 and Our Political Crisis. And the political crisis is primarily the fact that we are now in a 15-year war called the War on Terror, which has multiple theaters across the world and across the Middle East. Just the current fighting, the ongoing fighting in Afghanistan is costing us $4 million an hour, $100 million a day, and that's multiplied by the fight against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, the ongoing fighting in Iraq itself, and of course Homeland Security. So when all total, it's like $300 million a day. And the real problem is that in our political two-party system, we see no exit from this. Nobody's offering us a way out. So this speaking tour now, I'm not focused so much on the 9/11 as a crime, but on the war on terror, because I'm trying to help people understand that the war on terror was the real reason for 9/11. The war on terror was a pre-existing construct. It was set up in 1979, the late 70s, by the Likud, Menachem Begin and Mr. Netanyahu, and they had this construct set up, and they just needed a way to make it real, to make it start. It was like a bonfire. It was all set and fueled and ready to go. They just needed the match. So this is one of the first events in a 14-stop tour, and then I'll come back after San Francisco. I'll come back across the country. Those events will be added later. What's interesting to see is that in Massachusetts and even here, there is some organized resistance to prevent this message from being heard, and it seems to be that it's Jewish people or Zionist people who want to prevent other Jews from hearing this. It's in the more Jewish areas, that's where I'm getting the greatest resistance, because to a great degree, when you understand Zionism, when you understand the deception that the Jewish community is under, they want to keep that audience captive to their agenda. This is a photograph from of me protesting at the Oscars a year ago in California. The book is Solving 9/11, The Deception Changed the World. Just a little brief note about that. I have some books with me. The smaller book is the thesis, is Solving 9/11, The Deception Changed the World. This is my whole thesis presented in a very readable format of 360 pages in chapters. And this book was put together over a period of 5 years. The mother lode of information is in this larger book called 9/11, Solving 9/11, the original articles. And these are the articles in chronological order from September 2001 through April 2012. Some people are saying that I should, put the recent research in a new volume. And then there's, here, take this, Helia. And the third book that I have is a little different. This is our ABC Zoo book that Helia and I wrote. And this is a book for children, a little ABC Zoo book that I wrote with when my second child was born. And it's illustrated capital letters with nice watercolors and a little rhyme. So here, I'll take that one. And the thing is that this tour runs on donations. I created this tour. I mean, I started the tour in Europe, and I get donations from my people who are supporters of my events, supporters of my work. And then I go on tour, and then the tour itself runs on donations. So the books that I sell help, and any donations are, of course, welcome. My background is that I was an investigative journalist working in Washington, D.C. when 9/11 happened. And I wrote for a little weekly newspaper. And my specialty had actually developed over a period of about, at that time, 6-7 years of investigating government cover-ups of exactly such atrocities like 9/11. I really got started on this in Europe, investigating the sinking of a ship called Estonia, which 1,000 people died on the Baltic Sea in 1994. And I found that the government of Sweden and Finland and a couple other countries were actually complicit in covering up the truth of what happened to 500 of their own civilians who died. And I thought, well, Sweden can do this, It's like, this is crazy. And then in 2000, I attended the Flight 800, TWA Flight 800 final hearings at the NTSB in Arlington, Virginia. And there again, it was the cover-up was absolutely blatant. It was just in your face. And so then I realized that, this country, the United States, has a very serious problem in which terrible mass murders are covered up. And so then my background prior to that was that I got my degree at the University of California in Santa Cruz. My specialty was Israel and Palestine under Middle Eastern history. And having lived in the Middle East, having lived in Israel and traveled a great deal in the Middle East, I knew that the Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, was a most unusual conflict. That it is not just a dispute over territory or leadership. It's something much more complicated. And that it's not only is it complicated, it's sort of like central to our existence today. You wouldn't think that a country the size of a large California county with a small population of like 9 million people could be such an obstacle to peace in the Middle East, but it is. So I studied Israel and Palestine, but what was most interesting is that during the whole time I studied it, there were no courses available at any American university on the history of Zionism. Zionism is, of course, Jewish nationalism manifested in the state of Israel, in the Zionist parties. It cannot be confused, it should not be confused with Jewishness or Judaism. Although Zionists do confuse this issue a great deal. Zionism is a political ideology manifested in the creation of the state of Israel with a certain leadership. Jewishness or Judaism is a religion and Jewishness is an ethnicity. And these two are not completely the same. They should not be mixed as the same. And likewise, it's important to understand that there are many, many what we call Christian Zionists. In America, there's something like 40 million, 50 million people who are Presbyterians or whatever, they're Baptists, and yet they are completely dedicated to the Zionist cause, to the state of Israel, thinking that their religion obliges them to support the state of Israel. And Rudy made one point that I wanted to clarify. The Solving 9/11, The Deception Changed the World, one of the key chapters is chapter 7. I wrote that when I was in Europe. I wrote it in Estonia, and there was the media mogul there in that country was absolutely amazed by this chapter, and unbeknownst to me, he sent it to a fact-checking organization in Britain, and the fact checker that checked it was completely hostile to my thesis. He didn't agree with my thesis at all, but he checked 105 statements of fact in that chapter. It's called The Architecture of Terrorism, in which I name names and I show the connections to these organizations, these Israeli people and other people, and their connection to the conspiracy of 9/11. And of those 105 statements of fact in that chapter, all of them turned out to be correct. And he came up to me and said, "Chris, congratulations." I said, "What?" He told me that he checked it and it was 100% correct. And I said, "Well, that's what I expect. I mean, I check, of course, every fact, thoroughly before I put it in my book." So the question is, why is 9/11 truth so important? Here we are 15 years later. People say, well, that was 15 years ago, 3,000 people dead, they're buried, it's over. Why does it matter? Well, it matters for very much the same reasons as the Kennedy assassination. Why does the murder of John F. Kennedy matter so much today, 53 years later? Why is the murder of John F. Kennedy so important? Well, the murder of Kennedy matters because it was a coup d'etat. It was a coup d'etat, and the powers behind the assassination took control of the government and orchestrated the cover-up. And the newly installed president here, LBJ, played a very big role in that cover-up. And, of course, a coup d'etat that is kept secret in a democratic country means that the succeeding government is illegitimate. And U.S. military involvement, of course, spanned 2 decades, from 55 to 75, but our involvement in Vietnam spiked after the murder of JFK, of course. Now, the Kennedy assassination matters because the U.S. government continues to support the lies of the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission, of course, says that one man was involved and there was no conspiracy. And the Kennedy assassination matters because the mainstream media continues to support and even endorse the official version. The Kennedy assassination matters because when the government supports the lies about the murder of the president, it means that the powers that killed Kennedy are still in charge to this very day. This graph is a simple graphic to show you that the majority of the American population has always been of the opinion that there was a conspiracy, not a one-man operation. So why does 9/11 truth matter? For all the same reasons. 9/11 truth matters because the government continues to lie about what happened to this very day. We've been through 2 administrations. We're now on the brink of a 3rd administration. And from what I've heard from these candidates, there's no candidate out there who wants to address 9/11 truth or ending the war on terror. And 9/11 was a policy coup that brought us the war on terror and a series of costly wars. This was the event that changed American history and world history. 9/11 truth matters because for 15 years, the controlled media has pushed a false narrative about 9/11 and the war on terror, all the while suppressing evidence that disproves the official myth. And this graphic and these polls that were done show that the American population since 2002 has been polled showing that a great majority, 2/3 of 3/4 of the population, believe that the government was mostly lying or hiding something about 9/11. And those numbers increased over 75%. And then in 2006, when they found that only 16% of the population believed the government was telling the truth, they stopped polling. So this is our problem, our essential problem, is that if the government and media are lying to us about 9/11, it means that they are controlled by the people who carried out 9/11. That's a logical deduction because the only people who are benefiting or are protected by the cover-up are the culprits themselves, and the false narrative, and the war on terror. So why would the government cover up the truth about what happened on 9/11? 1, to protect the real culprits from being identified. 2, to prevent the official myth from being exposed as a pack of lies and fabrications. And 3, to advance the fraudulent war on terror. This is the Zionist war agenda that's being waged by the United States, which was the primary reason for 9/11. So 9/11 was in fact a highly sophisticated false flag terror operation that was designed to instill fear and rage in the population in order to compel U.S. public opinion to support the Israeli Zionist war agenda, open-ended war agenda, known as the Global War on Terror, where we have been since October 2001, and we are still firmly embedded today. So starting the war on terror was the actual reason for the false flag terror attacks of 9/11. It wasn't, though, that 9/11 happened and then they created the war on terror. The war on terror preceded and was the reason for 9/11. This is a photograph from San Francisco. It's a protest that the war on terror is a fraud. And the fraudulent war on terror is based on the official myth of 9/11. This is a little photograph showing the Zionist connection. This is in January of 2002. What is that, 4 months later? And this shows the Israeli chief of staff. His name is Shaul Mofaz. And he's meeting with the Zionist neocons at the Pentagon. He's got Wolfowitz on his left, Dov Zakheim across the table from him, and next to him Douglas Feith. And these 3 men are 3 of the most important members of what they call the Defense Policy Board. This is the Zionist neocons who created the policy beneath Rumsfeld. They created the policy that Rumsfeld signed off on that became the war on terror. And of course, we went directly into Afghanistan. This the United States invasion of Afghanistan began October 7th, 2001. It's interesting that Afghans were interviewed, I think it was like 2004 or 5, and asked if they understood why the United States was in their country. And 85% of them had no idea that it had anything to do with 9/11. They just said, well, Americans are here because they're here. Because that whole propaganda spiel that 9/11 led to the war in Afghanistan, that was designed for us, not for them. They don't care what the Afghans say. So as I said, the Afghanistan war is now costing the American taxpayer $4 million per hour of every day, of every week, of every year. And it's accumulated now to something like $738 billion, closing in on $1 trillion. For a war which really there's no American interest that we can identify. There's no reason that Americans can say, yes, we're there for this, we're there for that. Osama bin Laden's dead, so why are we still there? This is occupied Iraq. This is U.S. military camp Buqa, and this is the place that is known to be as the catalyst of the terror group ISIS. All the leadership of ISIS, this Islamic State, ISIL, are graduates of this place, and this is like a 4-year, 5-year institution. People like al-Baghdadi spent, I think, 5 years here, and he was a very high prisoner who intervened with other prisoners on different levels. And so you can say that ISIS is a product of their time spent at this Camp Buqa. The war on terror was, the real agenda of the war on terror was laid out by General Wesley Clark, and he talks about his experience going to the Pentagon just after 9/11. And he said, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon, and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. One of the generals called me and he said, sir, we've made the decision, we're going to war with Iraq. He said, we're going to war with Iraq? I said, why? He said, I don't know. I came back a few weeks later, he said, and by that time we were bombing Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? He said, oh, sir, it's much worse than that. We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. And of course, by reading the paper, you know we've already accomplished 5 of those. Lebanon is always kind of fractured. The only country that is left on the list, really, is Iran. Now, this regime change and balkanization of these Middle Eastern states, which is what's happening, is actually the implementation of something called the Yinon Plan. Oded Yinon is an Israeli guy, an Israeli strategist with the Likud party, who wrote this strategy out in 1982. It was published in an Israeli magazine in Hebrew called Kivunim, And it was translated by Israel Shahak, who was a wonderful professor of chemistry at Hebrew University, who thought that the Western world, the Americans, the non-Hebrew speaking part of the world, of humanity, deserved to know what Israeli strategy was for conquering the Middle East. And it basically is a plan of Balkanization. Balkanization refers to the breaking up of a large state like Yugoslavia into its ethnic components, which is now 7 little mini-states, Montenegro, Bosnia, Herzegovina, what have you. And this is the Israeli plan. It's called the Yinon Plan. And thanks to this publication, it was published in a magazine from Arab American University graduates in 1982, I believe, that we've been aware of this plan. And as you can see, Iraq and Syria are already basically de facto partitioned, and as is Libya. And of course, I said Lebanon, and Sudan was broken into 2. And so this is the plan, and this is the implementation of the plan that's been in effect since 2001. It's based, of course, on the constituent parts of these nations being, ethnically different. You have in Iraq, you have the Sunnis in the west, the Shiites in the south, you have the Kurds in the north. So, creating sectarian strife by carefully placed bombs, which is what they were doing for years and years, created tension between these groups, hostility, and then you break it up into pieces. Just like Humpty Dumpty. And that's what they're doing now in Syria. The question is, of course, is this a war of terrorism or a war on terrorism? And the facts, indicate that it is actually a war of terrorism, in which terrorism is the main tool, terrorism is the device, it's the mechanism, it's everything. It is the way the war is waged. So they use terrorism to instill hatred among these groups. They use terrorism as an excuse to make policy changes. And so what we're seeing in this country is we're seeing this also applied to us. 2001 was the big one. Recently in Orlando, that was the second worst, actually. It was the worst shooting, they say, in American history. But that's not counting things like Wounded Knee, where they killed several hundred people. But also terrorism. But the facts of the matter are is that terrorism has greatly increased. Terrorism in the Middle East, terrorism in the world has gone up 4,500% since 9/11. And it's much, much worse today than it was then. And it's particularly worse in those nations where we invaded, Afghanistan and Iraq. This graph is to show the amount of money that the United States spends per U.S. victim of these various causes of death: heart disease, influenza, cancer, and terrorism. And the United States is currently spending about $400 million per year per victim of terrorism. Because actually in the United States, death by terrorist attack is a very, very minor cause of death. Of course, there's been a spike with the events in Orlando, but in general, terrorism is not a problem in this nation. At least not a problem to spend $400 million per victim. Well, this is a comment by a man named Alan Sabrowski, who was formerly with the U.S. Army War College. And he made this, he came out in 2010, or 2009, 2010 with some statements about basically validating what I've been saying for years, that 9/11 and the war on terror is an Israeli construct. And what he said, the evidential trail for 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq runs from PNAC, that's Project for a New American Century, AIPAC and their cohorts, through the mostly Jewish neocons in the Bush administration, and back to the Israeli government. He says none of the denials and political machinations can alter that essential reality. And if you look, if you look at the impetus for war against Iran, it's coming directly from the Israeli government. It's coming from Bibi Netanyahu speaking here at AIPAC. Every chance he gets, he calls for the United States to invade Iran. Bibi Netanyahu, the man here on the right, is the current Prime Minister of Israel. He has a long history in the new Zionist organization. His father was the head of the NZO in New York City after Jabotinsky died. And the Jabotinsky School of Zionism became the NZO, the new Zionist organization. It is the most extreme, hardline, right-wing Zionist doctrine. And Jabotinsky, for example, wrote in 1923, he wrote an essay called The Iron Wall, in which he said that the Israelis the Jewish people in Palestine will have to build an iron wall separating the Jewish community, from the non-Jewish, the Palestinian community. And that's exactly what Ariel Sharon built in 2003, this hideous wall that runs through the whole Holy Land. The man sitting next to him is Ehud Olmert, another Likudnik, who happened to be in New York City on 9/11, although his presence in New York City was kept secret. Here he is 10 days after 9/11, or a little bit longer than that. He's meeting with, here is Olmert is on the left, and he came to act like a mentor, a big brother to Giuliani, saying that I come from a country where we know terrorism. But he never fessed up to having been in New York City on September 11th. So, you know, the New York police and Giuliani, of course, knew, the FBI knew he was there, immigration knew he was there, but it was kept out of the New York press, which is very unusual, very odd, because whenever a high-level Israeli comes to New York City, it's usually front-page news. And this man was actually the deputy prime minister at the time of Israel, and he was the mayor of Jerusalem, which happens to be the sister city of New York City. So why was his presence in New York City on September 10th and September 11th kept out of the news? And on September 11th, before the towers had even fallen, Israel's highest military official, his name is Ehud Barak, this man here, appeared in the studio in London of BBC World with his interpretation of what happened that day. And mind you, the buildings have been struck, but they haven't fallen yet. And he said, the world will never be the same from today on, he said. He said, we know who's behind this. It's Osama bin Laden. And even if it's not Osama bin Laden, you know, it's people affiliated with them. And we know where these people are. And he said, now is the time to launch an operational, concrete war against terrorism. Against terror. And he said that on the largest English-speaking broadcasting network in the world. BBC World is seen around the world. From Trinidad to South Africa to India, everywhere. They can turn on TV and they can see BBC World. So this was getting the message out. This is something called the primacy effect. When you're a false flag terrorist culprit, you want to get your explanation out there first, so that it carves an indelible imprint on the mind of the public that becomes the accepted truth. And what he said that day has never been changed in any way. It became the doctrine. Now, what is the relationship between Netanyahu, the godfather of the war on terror, and Ehud Barak? Well, they are longtime buddies that were in something called in Israel called the Sayeret Matkal. And the Sayeret Matkal is a covert, independent commando force that serves directly under the chief of staff. They call it independent because it's the chief of staff can just simply tell the Sayeret Matkal, go here, do this, do that. And that man I showed you before, Shaul Mofaz, the chief of staff at the time, the red beret on his shoulder shows you he was also Sayeret Matkal. So it's a very small group that operates covertly, does commando operations directly under one person, the chief of staff. And when Netanyahu was in the Sayeret Matkal, his commander was Ehud Barak. And there were other Sayeret Matkal people involved on 9/11. One of the passengers on Flight 11, I think it was a man named Daniel Levin, who was an American, born I think in Colorado, who was also a veteran of the Sayeret Matkal. So here the New York Times on September 12th, talking about the very simple explanation: hijacked planes destroy the Twin Towers and hit Pentagon in day of terror. And there's like 3 lies in that one sentence. Hijacked just, were they hijacked? Did they destroy the Twin Towers? Did one hit the Pentagon? No. These are all like, yeah, but the thing is that then we have this very interesting statement by Larry Johnson. He's a former deputy director of counterterrorism at the State Department. And he observed that this was a very sophisticated operation. He says, we have nothing. We don't have anything in history to compare with this. The only thing that comes close to it is a former Soviet intelligence operation. And these are some comments from JFK researcher Vincent Salandria from 1975, and they're very apt and they fit very appropriate to 9/11. 9/11 is very much like the murder of John F. Kennedy, and as per this quote, all the time it was obvious, it was blatantly obvious that it was conspiracy. I was in first grade when Kennedy was shot, and I knew it was quite clear that this was a conspiracy. And at that time, like 90% of the people thought so. And as in 63 on 9/11, again, Vincent says, the cover story was transparent and designed not to hold, to fall apart at the slightest scrutiny. Like the single bullet theory that one bullet went through all these people and then came out on a gurney in pristine condition, only to be found by, I don't remember who found it, and in a hospital. I mean, it's like, it's so in your face. 9/11 is exactly the same. You look at this building collapsing, is that a collapse or is that an explosion? When things collapse, they don't shoot things out laterally, hundreds of degrees with great velocity. Well, the fact of the matter is that the only thing that supports the 9/11 cover story is the controlled media and the government. That's the only thing that keeps pushing this false narrative and the fraudulent war on terror. Any information that contradicts the official myth has been omitted by the mainstream media. And as you know, in this country today, something like 95% of the media outlets in this country, news, radio, paper, print, are in the hands of 6 corporations. There's never been a consolidation of media in this country, anything like what it is today. It's very dangerous in a free society to have such a consolidation of the media in so few hands. Well, we have the pulverization of one of the towers, and as you can see, the towers were reduced to steel, which remained in place primarily within a few hundred feet of the tower, and this dust. Everything in the towers was reduced to dust. And these clouds that rolled through Manhattan were what they call pyroclastic, and that is that they contained fire. They contained a great deal of heat because they were at least 6% of the dust was tiny droplets of hot molten iron. The cost of the war on terror, this is just to give you an idea how much it costs. It's costing us now, just the wars since 2001 cost us about $8.5 million an hour for a total of $1.7 trillion. And that's a very conservative estimate. That's the money that's already been spent. When statisticians line up the future costs and the care for the veterans, what have you, it's about $4 trillion now. And Homeland Security is costing us another almost $7 million an hour. But wait a minute, we're spending all this money. We're spending our children's and grandchildren's money. We're spending their inheritances. What is the war on terror? And where did the war on terror come from? Well, the war on terror is an Israeli stratagem pushed by Netanyahu since 1979 to bring the United States into the Middle East to wage war on behalf of the Zionist state. Here's Bibi Netanyahu, and those are some of the books that he wrote in the 80s. He wrote a book called Terrorism, How the West Can Win, Fighting Terrorism, and as I said, in 1979 they had their first Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism, where George Bush spoke, the old man spoke, and he spoke on the final session, and in complete agreement with this idea of like waging war on terror. But when Netanyahu calls something terrorism, he has a particular definition of it. First of all, he uses the word terrorist to delegitimize Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. So whenever Palestinians are resisting the occupation, which they have every moral and legal right to do, he brands them terrorist, branding them illegitimate in the eyes of the public. And the other thing is that here are some Palestinian boys, some local terrorists, trying to stop the Israeli army from protecting their villages, whatever, with those big tanks. But the thing is that another thing about the war on terror is that Netanyahu, what he does is he conflates the United States and the Western world with Israel. He says that the Islamic terrorists, he says, attack Israel because we, Israelis,